This morning, we talked about all the stuff the Business Architecture Guild is doing, and one of the things that's been going on for a long time is the sausage making of standards. And these are our chief sausage makers here. Both of them are on the Guild's board of directors, and Jim is one of the co-founders. So Chalon Mullins, retired architect from Kaiser Permanente, and Jim Rhyne, retired architect from his own business. And there seems to be a thing here where you try to retire and then you're still here. But take it away, guys.
Okay, that's not the one that's going to make me go. All right. I think there's enough about the introductions. It's up there, whatever. The info is up there for the slides if you want to see a bit more about our backgrounds. But let's just go right into the discussion. So the Guild is an active member at two of the major open standards bodies in the I guess the IT world. The Open Group and the Object Management Group, which you know because we're here. And the idea is, from the Guild perspective, is that by putting our time and effort in, then we can influence how the standards evolve to align with the Guild's mission for enhancing and promoting best practices with regard to business architecture. So one of the major benefits that we see and we hope to see out of this is instill more consistency, continuity across organizations in how business architecture practices are conducted, et cetera. And through organizations like the OMG and the Open Group, influence also the vendor community, which hopefully yields then to tools that help you guys implement the practices that we all talk about, and you guys all help contribute to the evolution and development of. So in this context, the Guild has its expertise with the core and extended concepts of business architecture, with the definition of best practices, with the reference models, with the definition of business scenarios that are, kind of repetitive business problems, which business architecture then could have a tailored approach to. So with that, we bring that to the table. And at the OMG, we had this effort that's become the Business Architecture Core Metamodel. Jim will be updating that in a couple of minutes. And then at the Open Group has two different forums, actually, I think more than that, but two that are relevant to us. It has the Architecture Forum, then it also has something called the Archimate Forum. We participate in the Architecture Forum, but we do not participate in the Archimate Forum. However, Archimate becoming sort of this, more and more influential language for modeling enterprise architectures is definitely an influence that we track, we work on when we've done our work. I'll talk a little bit at the Open Group on it. One of the angles we consistently look at is, well, how would you say that in Archimate? But I want to be very clear, we're not trying to change or influence Archimate, except perhaps indirectly from how we see that TOGAF involved. But Archimate, some key Archimate vendors have been participants in the BACM, so that's a sort of a backdoor loop on that piece. That's probably more than you even want to know about the inner workings of Open Group, but I think it's important to make sure that's clear if you did happen to be aware of that. So I'm going to address the Open Group side of things. And here, what you see is there's really a very nice collaboration and fit. Because one of the areas that TOGAF knew, okay, I say TOGAF, I've already jumped into it. So before I start harping on acronyms, let's pause for a minute. TOGAF is the Open Group architecture framework. Okay, just for you didn't know. And it's the mainstay open sort of standard framework for doing enterprise architecture. There are a lot of competitors out there, but predominantly those competitors are owned, licensed, et cetera, by some sort of organization. This is the main one that's an open standard and available to anybody. And the building blocks of TOGAF are the architecture development method, the ADM, the architecture content model. So at the open group, you've got TOGAF and its architecture content model, and you've got Archimate, which is its own content model. So that's part of the complexity that we deal with in this environment. And just FYI, there are efforts there. I participate in some of these efforts to do harmonization, but there is no effort to consolidate or to land on one. They're both going to be there. And then one of the major things that goes on in TOGAF is about architecture as a capability. And when they use that term is ancient in the open group. Fortuitously, it aligns pretty well to what we mean by capability. So it's just treating architecture and enterprise architecture itself as a capability, and what governance models, et cetera, go along with that. But one of the areas that they were knowingly weak in, even though they did call out the need for it, is business architecture. So that's where there was this natural collaboration that could take place, where the BA Guild could provide the expertise that's encoded in the form of BizBoc and reference models, and then also the public side of things through the white papers, et cetera, and then bring that to the open group, and then now we can start enhancing and elaborating on the content that's in TOGAF. Now, one of the things is that while there is all this room for collaboration, there is also this potential for sort of like, are we getting into each other's territories here? If the Business Architecture Guild was starting to tell enterprise architects how to do enterprise architecture, that's a problem. Not so much an issue. We'd never probably try to do that. But the other way around, it was always a continual thing. Are we now getting to where the open group is going to be telling people how to do business architecture? We have a very, very simple boundary line here, which is that any content that's behind the member paywall at the BA Guild, and that's the BizBoc, that's the reference models, you all know, any of that cannot be cited in any of the work that we do at the open group. And so what we can cite is anything that's public, anything that's on the public side, the white papers, et cetera. And it turns out that's a lot of material and a lot of knowledge, or what's in the Business Architecture Quick Guide book. Those are all publicly accessible resources that can be leveraged. And that kind of naturally defines, this is how far you're going to go into actual business architecture just from a TOGAF perspective. But then we always make it clear, what you see here takes you this far. If you want to learn and know more, here is this other resource. It's not a marketing opportunity per se, but it's an opportunity to point to the more elaborate and informative content that's behind that member paywall. So I'll talk about some of the things that have been concentrations for us here in this, the BAWG, the Business Architecture Working Group. So the biggest win for us in the last, 6 years has just been to get TOGAF to adopt our definition of the term capability. If we did no more than that, okay, we did no more than that, we have huge wins, right? But then the second thing that we did was to get across the notion that business architecture as a domain has these 4 key concepts: capability, value, information, and organization. That all of a sudden gives some concreteness to what it means to be a business architect that was not really there before, or very, very scattered forms. So the other thing that we, to some extent, have dealt with, and we dealt with before, I think we saw there was an earlier presentation today where I got glimmerings of TOGAF content, and I can't remember exactly who it was. Oh, I think it was the power people. So one of the things that we hit immediately was the legacy use of the term business function in TOGAF. And what do you do with that? Because if you read the BizBoc, or you read Business Architecture Guild, et cetera, you're going to realize you don't hear that word. We don't talk about it. It's not one that we have found useful. Similarly, there's a lot of talk about business service, and I'll have a bit more to say about that in a second when you get to the TOGAF side of things. But often I remember discussions and things with Bill where it's like, that's not one of our 4 core concepts. That's not one of the building blocks there is. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Not necessarily the same as what's in TOGAF, but it's sort of then really getting the TOGAF people, the open group people, to understand what are really the important concepts from a business architecture perspective, not from your IT perspective, trying to drag into business is basically what's going on. And then the bottom line is the vision that was the foundation for the Guild was the paper that basically, it was 15 years ago, something like that, where it was like, hey, stop fighting over whether it's about value or whether it's about capability, and realize how those two things actually align, support, and that it's the combination of the two that gives us the power to turn this whole practice into something useful and meaningful. It's that concept that we've gradually been swinging the TOGAF world over to, and I have notes on that progress in a second. I'm of course way behind schedule already. Quickly a word about how this all works. TOGAF is huge. And there was, when I joined and started working on this, they were in the midst of like, hey, we're rewriting TOGAF 9, we're going to have TOGAF 10. Like 15 years into that, they were no closer to being done than they had, in effect, than when they had started. And at that point, they realized we have to do this a different way. We can't be so long between releases, et cetera. And so they adopted this notion of, instead of complete updates to TOGAF, they can do incremental releases of additional content in the form of series guides. And so that is how we have been progressively influencing the content in TOGAF, is through a series of series guides. And so here's sort of the history. There was an initial offering, which was one around the concept of capability. That was in March of 2016. That followed about a year and a half later with a first one on value streams. That was very quickly updated. So the current release on the value stream guide is actually from June of 2018. These are the numbers in, or the document numbers in the open group, if you choose to go there, and all of that content anybody can go access. Then there was a piece of work that was actually, and this is one of the things that we deal with, is there's work that's done that's not in the business architecture working group, but it's business architecture work. So there was something called the Open Business Architecture, OBA, at the open group, some wholly separate group that did a capability-based planning guide back in July of 2019. That has now been superseded. We did a guide on business models so they could understand what business models were about. We did a guide on information mapping. We did a guide on organization mapping. We did a volume 2 on the capabilities guide. And then the big thing was we did a capability-based planning guide. All of these things got done in 2022. They were in the works, obviously, for a while before that, but they all happened then. That capability-based planning guide was the one where this really all started to come together. It's the one where the value and capability combination really sold. So quickly about some of the future plans then. There's a lot that's still into, so basically we started by saying, here's the message from BA Guild. Here's how we think you can use it here. But what we didn't do a lot of was what's already in TOGAF and how does that reconcile? So that's a piece of work we have to go back to now. Like, for example, TOGAF calls out that we do value chains. Well, we don't do value chains. Good discussion about that one. Jim and I have talked about it many, many times. So at some point we have to say what's going on there, right? Then more importantly, we've been doing this a little bit sort of under the covers as we've been going, trying to get some of the BizBoc, trying to get the Metamodel work that we've been doing into TOGAF. And really we have. There's a big update that was in TOGAF 10 of the ACM of the content model that reflects some of this. But if you look on the right, and this slide could be the whole talk, honestly. But if you look on the right here, you can see the TOGAF content model, the core things that are related to business architecture. So there's organization unit, function is still there, okay? And business services there. Capabilities there related to goal and outcome, value stream is there, information, and then that's related to something, in TOGAF terms, data entity. This relates to the BizBoc conceptual model, but it's not the same. And there's translation that you got to do there. I do want to make one, I'm sorry taking this much, but there's one really important point I want to make before I move off of this and leave it that this is work that we're doing right now. When somebody says business blank, okay, and they use business as a modifier, that's deeply ambiguous, okay? It's very deeply ambiguous. Are we talking about something that is like of and about the business, or are we talking about something that is in business language? When TOGAF says business service or business requirement, they don't mean a requirement of or on the business. They just mean a technical requirement that is expressed in business terms, okay? When TOGAF says business service, they don't mean business service. They don't mean fill a prescription. They mean a technical delivery of that, okay? But it's a technical delivery that's described in business terms. Well, that's good. That's an advantage or whatever. But that's where we have a misalignment of concepts, because if we were to ever talk about business services, we'd be talking about real, actual business services. Okay. And so the analog of business service in that TOGAF model is the software service that's on the BizBoc conceptual model. So those are the kind of things that and then we talk about business object, they talk about information object. So we've already moved down a level. So that's the kind of thing that we navigate here all the time. So that's where we're going, but it's also a natural transition then to the next piece of the puzzle that I'll let Jim talk about, which is the work on the BACM.
Thank you, Chalon. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. So Chalon mentioned earlier, we have this collaboration between the Business Architecture Guild and the OMG. And let me start by telling you guys that aren't familiar with the OMG, something about the way it works, okay? The OMG is the standards definition organization, is a membership essentially composed of companies, okay? It's not composed of individuals, although at one point in time they had a consultancy membership, okay? But that has since gone away. And the idea is that they promote standards that allow companies that are in the business of doing things for various domains to provide tooling to those domains, okay? And the OMG is roughly split into two parts. There's a platform technical committee and a domain technical committee. The domain technical committee deals with industry-specific standards, such as standards for the government, standards for telecommunication, and so on and so forth. And the Platform Technical Committee deals with standards that largely affect technology platforms and vendors who provide tooling into those platforms. The OMG also has a consensus-based standardization process, right? Which means that in order to get a standard approved, all of the companies who have established voting rights with respect to the standard have to approve it. Okay. It also goes through a technical scrutiny by an OMG organization called the Architecture Board. And then finally, it has to be approved by the OMG Board of Directors. Okay. All right. So like Chalon was talking earlier, the Guild's role, and we've been, if you will, partners with the OMG for many, many years now, practically since the beginning of the Business Architecture Guild. But the Guild's role is to provide technical expertise, particularly for standards in the area of business. And the business stuff happens to be on the domain side of the OMG, not the platform side of the OMG. Okay, so what your takeaway from that is that when there's an effort made to produce a standard, it's essentially a two-stage process. There's a request for proposals that go out for the standards. There are one or more submissions made by individual companies or groups of companies against the standard. And then there's an often contentious and fractious and multi-year harmonization process. Sometimes these things don't survive. Okay, the submitters can't agree. Nobody has a sufficient number of votes to win, and the effort dies. And I would say that probably affects maybe 30% of the things that happen at the OMG. Okay, we managed to succeed in this. Okay, but there was a cost. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about what the cost was. All right, so moving on. Okay, some milestones. Those of you that went to reception last night and had the free food and drink got a more elaborate version of these various milestones. But basically, it started as far as the OMG is concerned in 2017 when we got the RFP issued, right? And then there was a lot of sausage making that went into finally getting the final version of the specification done in 2023. Okay, there is a revision task force. By the way, I should point out that the OMG has an open access, if you will, way of lodging issues against the standard specification. You do not have to be an OMG member to use this. Okay, there's a public web page called issues.omg.org where you can go and find out all of the standards that are in the finalization process or in revision process. And if you're familiar with the standard and you have something to say about it, you can register an issue. Okay, and that issue has to be dealt with. Okay, moving on. So talk a little bit quickly about the RFP. The RFP originally just required responses on capability. I won't go into the reason why that was the case, but it strongly encouraged submitters to cover value streams, organization, and information, the four key building blocks of business architecture. The final result actually includes those and quite a bit more, and I'm not going to recite what's on the slide. But we have pretty good coverage. One of the things that is still outstanding is the BizBoc and the Business Architecture Metamodel have a notion of policy. We don't have that in the Business Architecture Core Metamodel, but it's one of the open issues for the revision task force. One thing I want to highlight is we also took as a requirement, although it was not stated in the RFP, that people need to be able to model business architectures at multiple levels of detail. And anytime you do that, there is a consistency requirement across various levels of detail. right? If I assert, for example, and you'll see in a minute, that a certain business object scopes a capability, right? Later on, I can specify exactly what I mean by that. Okay, but the way I specify that has to be consistent with my original assertion about the scoping relationship. Okay. The primary tool that we used to generate the specification was a UML-based tool. I won't drag you through the details of trying to use UML to generate standards, but it doesn't support that kind of thing. Okay, and so as part of the submission, we actually invented a technique, okay, which we were able to glom onto the top of UML that allows us to do this. And the technique is called a shortcut. All right. So the OMG specifications, the detailed guts of the specification are delivered as a specification document, which you can read, and it's normative. Anything it says in the normative sections, compliant vendor has to implement those. It's delivered as an XML file of a particular form that's used for exchanging information about models at the OMG. And in this particular case, we also delivered an AL2 version of the BACM specification because increasingly we find vendors that are interested in working in RDF. All right. So I'm not going to take you through the whole meta model, but I'll give you just a glimpse at one part of it having to do with how we represented capabilities. And you can see here that there is some strange machinery, okay, that you wouldn't find in a normal meta model, or if you have read the Guild white paper on the meta model, you wouldn't find these things. One of those is something called an abstract capability. Okay, we use these things for technical reasons. It's basically to be able to create a union of two concepts that share a lot of the same properties. Okay, right. If you look carefully, and those of you familiar with UML will recognize that this is an abstract class, which means that in a tool, you won't see this. Okay, it's something that sits under the covers and allows us to do things more efficiently and more compactly. But it's not one of the things that you're allowed to create instances of. Okay, so we have capabilities that produce and need outcomes. This allows us to create, if you will, a web of connections between capabilities based on their outcomes. Outcomes are states of business objects. And if you notice, there's a couple of red lines in this diagram. Those are the shortcuts that I was talking about earlier. Okay. And each one of those shortcuts has a kind of logic formula associated with it that says what the consistency rule is for this. So in other words, if I assert that this business object scopes a particular capability, right? This gobbledygook that you see down in the bottom is a technical way of specifying exactly what that means, okay? And you can run a model checker, right, to make sure that that you've got this information in the model. And if not, the model checker will tell you that there are pieces of it that are missing that maybe you want to fill in. But this is all optional, right? There's nothing here that forces the architect to create detail that's not needed for any particular project. All right, just quickly, we also undertook as a requirement to prove the specification by building an implementation. I actually built two implementations to test out the meta model, if you will. And the test case was to be able to import all of the Guild reference models. And that was an interesting project that uncovered a couple of things that we're going to address in the 1.1 version of the spec, but it also uncovered a bunch of things having to do with the reference models. All right, so here's just a screenshot of one of the applications. It's not particularly interesting, something that I built primarily in order to be able to look at the output of the importation of the reference models and make sure that it was done correctly and that the meta models were also used correctly. There's another implementation that I don't have a picture of that's much more interesting because it not only gives you the entities that are in the reference models, but it also gives you the cross connections between the entities. So, but I didn't have that available for a screenshot at the time that I finished these slides a month ago. So if you want to see it, come find me and I'll be happy to show it to you. Current status and future directions. Okay. The final 1.0 version of the specification will appear on the OMG website. I can pretty confidently predict sometime within the next 30 days. Okay. Sometimes the publication machinery doesn't work that quickly. What we're doing is mainly three things. Looking at extending the BACM to completely cover topics in the BizBox. We're defining interoperability with OMG and non-OMG modeling specifications. There's ongoing work, for example, between the revision task force and the unified architecture framework people. And we've also looked at other OMG specifications like the BACM. One of the things I might mention, by the way, is if you read the spec, you'll see that we've already incorporated something called a structured metrics metamodel. So a compliant vendor then will allow you to attach metrics to any model entity, and you can construct your own library of metrics of whatever variety you find appropriate to the practice of business architecture. Okay, and also we're looking at extending the BACM to integrate with various system and software modeling specifications. All right, so that's it. And I think it is question time. So any of you have questions for myself or Chalon, speak up.
Come on, someone ask a question.
Thank you so much. This was very informative and useful. My question is regarding DTO, digital twin of an organization. So and I see OMG has a digital twin consortium. Should I go there to understand more about DTO? Is someone else working on DTO? What is the source for finding more about DTO?
Well, I'm actually not terribly equipped to answer that question, right? I mean, in a certain sense, you can look at a business architecture as a digital twin of a business, right? I think that makes perfect sense. But for a whole variety of reasons having to do with a primary focus that they have on digital twins for manufacturing, okay, we think it would be a bit distracting. And the other reason is that we just don't have the bandwidth, right, to cover all of the things that might be interesting from the point of view of the guild. Okay.
So Jim, you're aware the architecture-driven modernization task force at the OMG was looking at that last bullet point. I guess the only point I want to make is if anybody here happens to be an OMG member, we would love to get some energy into that discussion because there's a whole bunch of technical standards on the one side of the house, as you were saying, and there's business standards on the other side, including this one. They're not connected to each other, right?
Yeah.
So we are talking about trying to make that connection, which, by the way, in 2008, when I wandered into the business modeling and integration task force was my goal. I didn't think it would take 16 years, but patience is important when you're dealing with standards.
Yeah. Okay. So to amplify a little bit on what Bill was saying, the architecture-driven modernization of the ADMTF, as we call it, that's on the platform side of the OMG. Okay. And And there's an effort ongoing there to make the cross connection between technical specifications about particularly software systems, okay, with the Business Architecture Core Metamodel. Okay, that's what he was referring to.
Okay, well, I find this stuff really interesting, by the way, and I didn't see too many eyes glaze over. But there is real architectural rigor behind what we do here at the Guild. And we rely on guys with really big brains to do this really intricate, detailed stuff. So let's give them a hand. And thank you very much.
Yeah, Mike.
And we have a little extra time for the coffee break because there's going to be like brownies